central theme for Armenian Americans in particular because of their experience of blatant denial, but it was actually mentioned across all 4 groups. The Armenians talked mostly about blatant denial. Other groups, such as the 2 refugee communities, talked mostly about more passive forms of denial, which are really about ignoring, silencing, omitting narratives of, their historical narratives of suffering, talking about the fact that nobody knows about this, nobody talks about it. Here in the US, people don't really know what happened to us. What I also found very interesting was that Armenian participants expressed a sense of competition over acknowledgement of different groups suffering. And so specifically, they pointed out that the Jewish American, that Jewish Americans or Jews in general experience greater recognition of the Holocaust, of their group's experiences of suffering, while their group doesn't. And in their discussion of these topics, they also express a sense of, they express how this basically drives a wedge and kind of undermines both inclusive victim beliefs between these groups, but also solidarity. They talk about the fact that they actually resent this a little bit. So this is just important for nations or politicians to know about. And I think actually right now we see these debates in Germany as well. I've been following them a little bit about the recognition of the Holocaust versus colonial genocide and other collective violence. And it is important to know that people, that members of victim groups may, process this with, or this may have a negative impact on relations between different minority groups when people experience such different degrees of acknowledgement in society. All right. I will just very briefly go over this. As I mentioned before, what participants also noted as important was their experience of solidarity with outgroups, including other victim groups, but also third parties, and sometimes even a few allies among the former perpetrator group. At the same time, they also talked about experiences of betrayal through other groups, how other groups had, for example, not been good allies to them or had harmed them in several different ways. So again, we see kind of the presence of both of these poles within their experience, but in general, just to note that along with acknowledgement, solidarity versus negative outgroup experiences are an important topic for collective victim beliefs. And then finally, power relates to this question before about perceiving victim groups as powerless, which is the common assumption in our literature, mostly based on the needs-based model. But what we see here is that while participants noted that obviously the outgroup had the perpetrator group in this case, had power over them, and their group's victimization and oppression was caused by outgroup's dominance over them, they also talked about many different ways in which their group actually had power as well. So for example, they talked about how their own group's successes or their own group's strengths, their own group's power in some ways had made the perpetrator resentful and had kind of caused them to persecute them. They talked about narratives of resistance during, for example, the Armenian genocide or other forms of violence. And some also talked about and acknowledged the in-group's role in oppressing others, which is another form of their power, their dominance over other groups. So here I find it important to note that this perception of lacking power among in-groups is when we conceptualize power merely as dominance, but there are other theoretical conceptualizations of power in the field that look at a broader basis for different power bases, such as in Prato and colleagues' power basis theory, or community psychologist Priletensky's work that defines also resistance as one form of power. So we need to expand our conceptualizations of power as well, in addition to expanding how we think about collective victim beliefs. All right, skipping this. So to summarize, and actually I have very briefly after that another study that I'll just quickly flash at you, but to summarize what I've said so far, I think these studies show that the assumptions in the literature we have so far on collective victimhood are problematic. We see that intergroup relations are by far not always the most relevant aspect. Intra-group dynamics, coping strategies, ideas about the in-group's power, etc., are crucial as well. If we just focus on comparative victim beliefs, we may be missing the mark. It may not simply be what is most relevant to participant groups. In fact, it can even be insulting in sometimes. And for sure, competitive victimhood is not the default, as we see across many different studies, even though this is commonly assumed in the literature. Moreover, collective victimhood itself is not always central to all group members, even to highly identified group members. So this is another assumption that we have to question in our studies. Collective victim beliefs are dialectical in that they are not just about vulnerability and harm and grievances, but they are also about power, agency, and resilience. So it is important to incorporate in social psychology and of course in peace psychology, more perspectives from community psychology and liberation psychology, critical psychology, fields that talk more about power, agency, and resistance, and not just that do not just kind of perpetuate this pathologizing view on collective victimization. Overall, much more complexity as well as attention to the context of collective victimization and its aftermath is needed. And so in our current studies that we're working on right now, again with Kollege Kos and some other collaborators, we are conducting Q methodology studies where we drew on 60 different statements capturing different collective beliefs. So here we went beyond the social psych literature and looked into other fields and more qualitative studies and so on to pull out different ways in which people have been talking about cultural trauma, historical trauma, etc., and what they have been finding. And so again, using a range of different contexts, we asked participants to rank these statements. I won't go into the details, and there is another talk on Q methodology later today, and I think many of you are familiar with it through Ko's missionary work on promoting Q methodology. But basically, Q methodology is about sorting and ranking the perceived importance of these different statements. So we asked participants to do this. They've sorted into a pyramid scheme like this. And then we see across all participants what kind of common holistic sorting patterns are to get at a few different viewpoints within each community. And so just very quickly to end on kind of some preliminary findings we have, I think they somewhat confirm but also go beyond what we've been seeing in these other studies. One is that all the groups, all the viewpoints entail a lot more focus on actually intra-group support without focusing in any way on intergroup relations. So many of these viewpoints completely ignore, don't talk about the perpetrator group, other victim groups, anyone. It's really mostly about how the in-group has been coping or supporting each other, you know, doing different things to strengthen the in-group, preserve their culture, their collective memories of victimization, etc. Many of the viewpoints were about or entailed acknowledging, educating about, commemorating in-group victimization. This was across all communities. And again, the focus on powerlessness was very rare. And instead, many factors emphasized in-group power. They pushed back, rejected ideas about lack of power, and instead talked about the in-group strength, ways of further strengthening the in-group, rejecting the victim label, emphasizing resistance and resilience instead of or in addition to collective victimization, and also talking about survival as a form of strength in light of centuries of oppression. In the minority groups that are currently experiencing ongoing oppression, Black Americans and the Kurdish diaspora from Turkey and the US, we saw surprising or very interesting similarities between the groups, that they both emphasized struggles for justice and acknowledgement, but again, while actually rejecting negative intergroup relations. They weren't interested in the perpetrator group, they weren't interested in revenge, in distrust, etc. It was simply about give us justice, give us reparations, give us acknowledgement. That's all we want. We forget about the rest. They also emphasized survival, resistance, and resilience, and in addition to the importance of commemorating their group's victimization. Among the majority groups and the minority group with primarily historical experiences of victimization, so the Hungarians, South Koreans, and Jewish Americans, again, very surprising similarities. All of these three groups, this is preliminary, but so far it looks like all of these three groups had two main factors, two main viewpoints that were quite similar across these three very different groups. So one was a focus on inclusive victim beliefs and inclusive lessons of the in-group's victimization, sometimes while also acknowledging that their status and power has improved today and that they also played a role as perpetrators and not just victims of harm doing. And then the second factor was about strengthening and preserving the in-group, its culture, collective memories of collective victimization, etc. All right, I'm done. Thank you. Sorry for throwing so much information at you. And if there are questions, I can answer them in English or German, or maybe some broken Polish as well.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It was really great and